Bitcoin has stabilized here for now, but the escalation in the Middle East conflict continues, and we're seeing a major flight to safety. We'll take a look at the background and what's currently happening, statements from Donald Trump, and what happens next. Is the big Bitcoin turnaround coming? The development isn't actually as bad as it looks right now. We've really managed to stabilize here again between 104 and 5,000 US dollars. Also very important, now is not the time to panic. Now is not the time to make any panic sales. Turning bearish now could be fatal. We've seen this happen again and again in the past. We also want to compare this to other conflicts that have happened recently to see how quickly Bitcoin has sometimes recovered. Now we have some statements that might give us clues about what could be coming next. And besides that, we're seeing a big move towards safety, meaning into risk-off assets. We see the dollar stabilizing, oil going up, and gold going up. Donald Trump is also issuing a major warning here, and we're seeing exactly what has happened so many times before. Global uncertainty is once again leading to sell-offs in Bitcoin. Of course, in general, well, I wouldn't call it panic yet, at least not in the Bitcoin market, but there is general uncertainty. It's definitely a real challenge not to get shaken out in this bull market. So go ahead and hit the like button below if you're still bullish, if you still want to see new all-time highs, and if you want to help push the Bitcoin price higher. We need every like. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit the subscribe button below. And as we can see here, for example, gold is on the move. Yesterday, it was 3% away from its all-time high, and now it's just 2% away from the all-time high. This just shows us the risk-off characteristics of gold. We can also see crude oil here, up 8%. But we also see the dollar rallying here with a safe haven rush after Israeli strikes Iran. So the dollar has stabilized here because, of course, many people have fled to the dollar. But at the same time, U.S. Treasury yields rise after Israeli strikes on Iran. So the bond yields are still under pressure here. And honestly, Bitcoin may have crashed down to 44,000 US dollars here. Let it drop down to 43 or 42,000 US dollars as well. That's still not as bad as some people might imagine. Sure, it's definitely a bit of a setback for now, but we can also see that things have stabilized somewhat. It doesn't look like it's going to drop below 100,000 right now, but who knows? I might upload this video and suddenly, bam! It falls below 100,000 if something black swan-like or unpredictable or something along those lines happens. But what's really important is what I want to show you here. And this also fits into the pattern we've seen so many times with other crises. We'll also get into what's actually happening right now here in the Middle East a bit later. But if we just go through the crises since 2023, we always see a pattern. And take a look and see if you notice anything. For example, on March 10th, we had the banking crisis and the collapse of Silvergate. At that time, Bitcoin was here. Then in May 2023, we had fears about the debt ceiling and regulatory crackdowns, so basically restrictions. Back then, suddenly Bitcoin was at 25,000. That means we had a drawback here in March 2023, but then in May we went back up after everything seemed bad at first. Then we had the next crisis here. What happened? We went up again, this time from 25,000 to 26,000. Then there was the next crisis here in June 5th and 6th, 2023. These were indictments against Binance and Coinbase. What happened after that? We did crash, but by August we were already at 50,000. That was, of course, August 1st, basically a year later. And now the conflicts are coming up. 2024, April 13th to 18th, we had Israel, Iran, drone attacks. What happened? Bitcoin was at 60,000 US dollars. Of course, at first we had another crash, but then later in October it went up to 62,000. Then we had another crash, Iran missile attacks, a drop. But then later on March 6th, 2025, it went up to 84,000 US dollars. Then we had another crash, Donald Trump's reserve order disappointments. Bitcoin dropped, only to then climb up to 102,000 US dollars here on June 12th. And we had already reached 100,000. So this is already the drop here. And that means the next crisis that comes will very likely also happen when Bitcoin is at an even higher level. That means we might have another crisis again then. Then Bitcoin won't be at 102,000 US dollars, but rather at 110, 130, or even 140,000 US dollars. So we can clearly see the patterns here. And it's also important to understand why, for example, is oil going up right now? Why is gold going up right now? And why isn't Bitcoin going up yet? So first of all, it's also because at the moment when the situation escalated here, the other assets simply weren't tradable. They couldn't be traded. That's obviously the first reason that basically only Bitcoin could really be traded. But that's not entirely true either. You can also trade other commodities to some extent. Oil, for example, also moved during that time and so on. But Bitcoin has always been the one that people sell off first whenever there's some kind of conflict. only to later realize, hey, it actually wasn't that bad. And then they get back into Bitcoin. We've seen these kinds of reactions many times. When the stock markets are closed and people need liquidity, even if it doesn't make sense, they just want to move into dollars. You can see that here as well. Here we also have the report that the dollar is rallying or strengthening because people want dollars. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Just imagine there's a crisis and everyone wants to have toilet paper. It's kind of like during the sea crisis. Back then, everyone wanted toilet paper too, but now people don't want real toilet paper. They want the fake toilet paper. So they want fiat money. And then everyone moves into so-called safe assets, like the US dollar, or maybe into gold and so on. Later on, the shifts can happen again, you know. Josh Mandel also gave an update here yesterday and said, in his opinion, Bitcoin will follow and rise in the second half of June. So, it will follow the gold rally again. We've seen this happen a lot lately. Gold rallies first, and then Bitcoin shoots up even more strongly afterwards. But now let's take a look at what's generally been happening here, especially regarding the conflicts in the Middle East and what's going on there. So first of all, we see Trump telling Iran that they should make a deal. He also made a really big tweet saying, hey, they need to make a deal. And here's a quote, a lot more will be coming from Israel. It's only going to get worse. So right now, there are really two scenarios. Either things get even worse, or they reach a deal, and the whole situation somehow settles down. It's also being reported that the US president issued an urgent warning and pushed Iran to negotiate. He added that Israel is far from finished and the situation could escalate even further. Apparently, the US was also aware of the whole thing. They apparently knew there would be attacks, because it was somehow a coordinated situation. But he also says here that there is a second chance. He said that there was already a 60-day ultimatum, and now 61 days have passed. I told them what to do, but they just couldn't get it or couldn't get there. Now they have perhaps a second chance. So now there is a second chance. And it seems that quite a few people were specifically targeted and killed in this attack. So, higher-ranking people who were probably deliberately eliminated. Of course, I don't think that's great either. Every dying person, every human life lost, is one too many. I don't want to judge the whole thing either, but rather just go through the statements that have been made from various sides. And here we have a very interesting assessment from James Lavish on this. He says that, in light of increasing geopolitical conflicts, investors often flee to fiat-based government bonds in search of safety. Of course, this is ultimately a mistake, because inevitably money printing and currency devaluation will soon follow. Smart investors flee to assets that do not lose value. And of course, the smartest move is to go into Bitcoin. And that's exactly what I said earlier. It's actually irrational to put all your money into gold now. Sure, you can do gold, but to pour all your money into US dollars or other fiat currencies just doesn't make sense. Because when we have situations like war, as we see with arms deliveries, and so on, you can see what happens. More money has to be printed again. So you're really in a bad spot with the US dollar. That means, at best, the US dollar is only a very, very short-term solution here, but never a long-term one. And what's interesting here is that, despite all this, the yields on US government bonds keep rising. We're even seeing some pretty sharp increases, sometimes up by 1% in a single day, with some bonds in the green, the 30-year bond almost back over 5%, and the 10-year also above 4.5%. That was always a critical threshold, where Donald Trump would often step in whenever the 10-year went above 4.5% and the 30-year went above 5%. But what's really striking now is that investors' risk behavior is starting to shift a bit, because normally, it's actually counterintuitive. If, for example, everyone is moving into the US dollar, then bond yields should actually go down, since if there's rising demand for US bonds, the yield should decrease. But what's interesting is that we're seeing a flight to the dollar, and yet we're still seeing weakness in US government bonds. And there are several reasons why that's not happening this time. The first is that the safe haven effect is still working in favor of the dollar. So of course, the US dollar is still benefiting from this. That means the US dollar still has that strong reputation as a safe haven. That's why, especially in the context of war, many US investors are buying dollars. And that's why the dollar is rallying. But now comes the interesting part about the bonds. Bond yields are still rising though, because inflation expectations remain high. First, because of tariffs, and second, because oil prices are going up. When oil prices rise, that's always a sign that inflation is likely to increase. Of course, when the price of gold goes up, that's also a sign that inflation is on the rise. But with oil, it's even more extreme because oil is truly a direct driver of inflation. Gold is just an indicator, because when oil prices go up, basically everything gets more expensive. Every product becomes pricier since transportation costs increase. Many services also become more expensive because they're connected in a chain and depend on products, and so on. So oil really is a very, very big factor. We've seen it time and again during major conflicts. Oil prices go up because oil is also a kind of safe haven asset, but one that directly impacts inflation. This will also be tough for Donald Trump, to be honest, because he wants to lower interest rates, right? But with rising inflation, that obviously becomes even more difficult. Then we also have the US budget deficits, which are exploding. Risk premiums are rising. Geopolitics, more uncertainty, higher risk premiums. Risk premiums on long-term bonds. Fed rate cuts are off the table for now. Higher for longer. At least, that's the current expectation here. And the crazy thing is, we no longer have a classic risk-off-driven bond market here. Government debt is now dominating even over global uncertainties. And the crazy thing is, in these uncertain markets, some investors now prefer to sell their US treasuries rather than buy more of them. In the past, that was never even imaginable here. There are even hedge funds now that are shorting government bonds because they simply find the fiscal situation catastrophic. And that's the extreme situation we're facing here. For Bitcoin, all of this is good news. There's also the so-called bond apocalypse that many people are talking about, which is supposedly approaching, and this is yet another sign that we're heading straight into the bond apocalypse. And if you don't have any Bitcoin during this third turning, you could get massively rug pulled, even if it goes down in the short term. You shouldn't let yourself get unsettled by that. In the long run, things still look very, very good. These are all dip opportunities. Both are dip opportunities, at least in my opinion. Of course, this isn't financial advice. Do what you want. Let me know in the comments if you've already bought more. If you want to buy Bitcoin, I'll put a link below for 2021 Bitcoin. Here you can buy Bitcoin easily and safely. With the code Bitcoin Hotel, you can always get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin. Definitely check it out and buy the dip. Guys, we'll see each other soon in Valhalla. Until then, peace out.